Welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran, and this week I wanted to talk a little bit about sports media, about how we cover sports media, and just how things might be changing a little bit. The reason I wanted to get into this topic this week is because two things that are pretty unrelated happened, but I thought they were kind of a little bit more related than we might think. So the first thing is the NFL's annual top 100 player rankings came out, and surprisingly for a lot of fans and analysts and pundits, whatever, Patrick Mahomes was not ranked number one as he was the year before. Instead, he was ranked number four behind Tyreek Hill, who was number one, Lamar Jackson, and Christian McCaffrey. And a lot of people had issues with that. Some people justified the vote for Tyreek as number one just because of his ability, but a lot of people were kind of surprised by that. And the second thing is that Skip Bayless, the former Dallas columnist and journalist turned TV media personality on shows like ESPN's Cold Pizza, then First Take, then Undisputed, it was announced that Fox was moving on from Bayless, and it was kind of the writing was on the wall on that. You kind of noticed the dip in his popularity and ratings and such after the fallout with Shannon Sharp that resulted in Shannon Sharp doing his own thing, him joining First Take, and eventually elevating onto the next stratosphere with shows like Club Shay Shay. So those two things happen. Again, not really related, but I think what it really shows us is the way that the current sports media landscape is set up, the whole apparatus, the way it goes, the way we kind of are at the altar of these kind of content-driven narratives that, a lot of the content creators kind of put out there. So I kind of want to get into both of these stories here and kind of tie it all to how it relates to sports media and where we're going in general in this space. So let's start with Mahomes at 4. You can argue that there may be a little bit of Kansas City Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes fatigue, right? That, they won another Super Bowl. Yes, he's the greatest quarterback of this generation. Yes, Kelsey is awesome. And then you had the Taylor Swift angle, which dominated the news cycle a little bit last season. And you could reasonably understand why some people would be over the whole Chiefs thing, right? But I would argue that the reason why you have to put Mahomes number one is, as we talked last week when we talked about the Jordan Love extension, there is no more important position in the game of football than quarterback. It is far and away the most heavily skewed position in the league, right? So the way I kind of look at it is there are 3 to 4 super important positions in football. The quarterback is far and away number one. Number 2 is your offensive tackle because they have to protect the quarterback. Number 3 is your edge rusher because they have to attack the quarterback. And number 4 is a receiver, a running back that could catch passes out of the backfield, right? Because they need to make plays using throws from the quarterback. In the end of the day, it all revolves around the quarterback. I've been saying this for a long time. And you have Lamar Jackson up there. Now, consider the source. I love Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson is my favorite NFL player. But he's not where Patrick Mahomes is right now, right? The thing that I think is important to remember is when it's money time, when it's winning time, when it's 2 minutes left in a playoff game in Buffalo, who do I want to have the ball in their hands? And the answer is Patrick Mahomes. He can make every throw. He can improvise. He's shown an ability to run. He could do all these things. With Lamar, there's certain limitations, right? Like, he's a freak athlete who could run. The arm strength is better than advertised. The accuracy is better than advertised, but still kind of comes and goes. Mahomes has none of these problems in the sense that there is no question of his arm strength. There's no question of his accuracy. There's no question of any of it because he's the best quarterback that's around right now. Then you look at Tyreek Hill and Christian McCaffrey. Let's start with McCaffrey first. McCaffrey's the focal point of the San Francisco offense, which was a very good offense last year and did incredibly well in the playoffs. McCaffrey, as a running back, is already kind of limited from what the modern game places as important, right? But he could carry the ball, he could catch the ball, he could do a lot of things for you in that way. But a lot of times, if you shade an extra defender to him, if you stack the box, you could maybe limit a little bit of his effectiveness. And then the beauty for San Francisco is they could then go to Deebo Samuel or Brandon Ayuk, right? And then you have Tyreek Hill, who is a matchup nightmare for any defender. He's by far the fastest receiver in the league. He is somebody that is the focal point. When you play Miami, he's the focal point. He's who you want to stop. But ultimately, when it's come down to it, he has been able to be somewhat neutralized later in these cold weather games, and Miami has been limited because, again, their quarterback is not as good as the quarterback on the Chiefs or the Bills or the Ravens, right? So that shows the importance. Now, does this mean that the number one player in the league has to be a quarterback every single time? I hate to say it, but it kind of does, because when you place this much importance on a position, it's hard to really stand out unless you are just a freak generational talent. So, like if you are a wide receiver, and you want people to be able to justify why you are the best player in the league, you have to be able to do it on the jet sweep, do it on all these different type of actions to really justify that. And, it's not fair, right? Because the game itself, it's not a meritocracy where, every position is of equal level of importance. It's the quarterback is way up here, and then everybody else falls way down, right? In terms of the pecking order of what teams prioritize and what the game prioritizes as the most important position. So I think that when you are talking about Mahomes, there is fatigue, just like there was Brady fatigue, right? For the longest time, it was pretty obvious that Tom Brady was the best quarterback in the league. And people would say, well, you could make an argument for Aaron Rodgers, or you could make an argument for so-and-so and so-and-so, Peyton Manning, whoever. But at the end of the day, the guy who won all the rings, the guy who is widely respected as the greatest quarterback of all time, is number 12 for the Patriots and Bucks, right? So that's just kind of the nature of the beast. But this type of thing is the type of list that just drives people on social media bananas, right? This is what gets people talking, it gets people debating, it creates content. And the thing about the top 100 list, so you're led to believe that it's a list voted by the players on the players. So it seems incredibly valid, right? Because you're seeing the players vote on their peers. But there have been a few instances. Andrew Whitworth, a few years ago, the former Rams and Bengals offensive lineman who's headed to the Hall of Fame, he said that it's really more of a content generation. Not all players are asked. So it seems a little invalid, and it has had a lot of criticism over the years over are all the players actually voting for this, right? So to me, it's more of a content mechanism, right? We're in the last few weeks here before the NFL regular season starts up. People are kind of doing their fantasy drafts, and they're getting ready for that, and they're getting ready for the preseason. The Hall of Fame game just happened, whatever. And you need something to kind of drive up conversation and interest in the meantime. The way you do that is by having a top 100 list. The way you do that even more is if you vote somebody number one that a lot of people are going to disagree with. And there are some people who think Tyreek Hill is the best player in the league. And there are some people who vehemently disagree with that notion just because of the playoff success post Kansas City. So that is a tool for being able to create all this engagement around this list, right? So I think of it more as a content tool than an actual metric of greatness in the NFL. And this brings me to Skip Bayless, because Skip is, I've seen Skip on TV for the better part of 2 decades. He was, of course, previously a legit beat reporter, columnist, and journalist in Dallas. He was very prominent during the 80s and 90s, during the SMU run in the 80s and the Dallas Cowboys run in the 90s. And what really kind of propelled him from just another good journalist into the take factory that he became was his book about the Cowboys, where he suggested that Troy Aikman was gay. He had really no evidence of this. Troy vehemently pushed back on it, especially like in the 90s. That was probably at that point, as wrong as it sounds today, that was probably considered slanderous behavior to even suggest that somebody was gay, right? But anyway, that's kind of where Skip got the taste of throwing out takes, right, and seeing what happens. And you fast forward, and he was on Cold Pizza, which became First Take. Their popularity hike came when he was debating Stephen A. Smith, and the whole idea of a hot take or just becoming a quote unquote opinionist became much more common in the sports lexicon. So you would watch First Take, and they would start doing these debates, right, where they would just be yelling at each other. They would, obviously the LeBron Jordan debate is one that they constantly go back to. The Cowboys always were good for ratings, so they would talk about the Cowboys. Also helped that Skip as a Cowboys fan, so that kind of plays to his interest. They would talk a lot about the Lakers, mostly when Kobe was there, and even more so when LeBron got there. And it was just a lot of far-reaching legacy stuff and stuff that wasn't really quantifiable. They didn't really cover games from the previous day as much unless it had, a couple of the big figures, right? So use the NFL as an example. They would cover a game for the Patriots because of Tom Brady. They'd cover a game for the Packers because of Aaron Rodgers. They probably weren't really talking about a Carolina Panthers or Jacksonville Jaguars game because, those they didn't really have these crazy takes to really justify that. So a lot of media people, specifically people who are in Fox Sports, in the Fox Sports realm, who have worked with Skip Bayless, have said, "Oh, he ushered in this new genre, right?" And a lot of deference and respect has been paid to Skip, basically for the strides that he's made in sports media in terms of changing the format, right, to make the debate format the more popular format, as opposed to a more narrative-driven storytelling type deal that it was, or reporting on the game aspect that it was as well, into something that was more overarching, controversial opinions. Like, when he spent his LeBron James' entire career denigrating LeBron James as a basketball player, right? Where it didn't matter what he did, he was always worse than Michael Jordan, right? And in some cases, he would start denigrating him even more. And that led rise into people like Stephen A. Smith, the way Shannon Sharp has kind of become, Max Kellerman when he was on First Take. These are all people who have sort of followed this Skip Bayless model. And in that aspect, yes, he is a trailblazer, one whether you like it or not. Now, a lot of fans have come back and pushed back and come and said, he made sports media worse, because you have a lot of people now where the term legacy is used a lot because of Skip Bayless. The where does this stand all time idea. We can no longer look at a game or a season or a championship in a vacuum. We have to compare it to previous eras, right? Like when the Celtics won, they'd be like, yeah, but the injuries, does this make it a less valid, asterisk-laden title, right? A lot of that type of thought process and ideology was brought on by the Skip Bayless era of hot takes. And what I think Skip identified and the resulting entire apparatus of sports media identified is that people like to argue with one another. People like to debate one another. People want to feel like they're right, and they want to aggressively showcase that opinion, right? So this is kind of magnified in the era of social media. You could look into the algorithms of X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, any of them, and a lot of times they are going to amplify a post that is divisive, right? We see it in the political space all the time. We saw it this week at the Olympics with the with the female boxer from Algeria, where incorrectly people were labeling her as trans when she really isn't, and it created this firestorm, right? And even if you don't watch the Olympics, don't like boxing, don't like sports, there's a good chance that that post came up on your social media feed because it had a lot of engagement, a lot of comments, and a lot of people going back and forth and name calling and all that stuff. So Skip Bayless and the rest of social sports media realized this years ago. So what do they start doing? They start saying stuff and clipping stuff that becomes controversial, right? The whole, well, Tom Brady isn't that good. The whole, LeBron James, wouldn't have lasted in the 1990s. All these things that can never be fully proven out that were kind of used as fodder by these. So the formula then becomes you do it on TV, right, or on a podcast or whatever. Then you clip 1 to 2 minutes of this, and that kind of led rise to this aggregation culture where kind of people's comments and takes and opinions and quotes are taken a little bit out of context. We see this in like all the player-driven podcasts where they'll have one little nugget but ignore the rest of it as well. And then so that gets clipped, and then people react to it, right? And you clip the stuff that you know is the most controversial. You clip the stuff that is going to really rile up a fan base, and like if you wanted to talk about like Kobe Bryant, before he passed, a lot of people have not really said anything about Kobe since he passed because, people generally don't want to talk down on people who have passed away. But people say, oh, well, he wasn't that good all time, and where do you rank him all time as he winds down his career? He was always a Michael Jordan imitator, 90% of what Michael Jordan was. And it really kind of causes this huge debate because the Lakers are a huge brand. Kobe is a huge brand in and of himself. And then, you bring out like the Shaq debates and what would happen if they would have stayed together and all this other stuff. And it just gets engagement, gets views. So those in sports media are empowered and emboldened to do more of that, right? To double down. We see it on FS1 with the First Things First show with Nick Wright and Chris Broussard. Those guys, while I think very well informed and good faith media people, will double down on a take that is maybe incorrect. We saw it with Max Kellerman, where he was often kind of denigrating Tom Brady, and it's like, oh, he's going to fall off a cliff. And Brady, of course, goes on to win a couple more Super Bowls, and he looks foolish. And people, that's where accounts like Freezing Cold Takes became popular because people would just say stuff to really drive attention, get people to click, get people to watch, get people to subscribe. And it didn't matter how wrong it was. The idea was if you got a lot of views. And this is an era that was really, its poster child, I think, was Skip Bayless. And eventually its new poster child now is either Stephen A. Smith or maybe even Nick Wright from FS1. So it becomes a thing where you're just going to throw out a take to get people to watch, right? And it's really shock value more than informational journalism at a certain point. And I think we've reached a point, though. And you saw this with Skip's kind of diminishing popularity after Shannon Sharpe left. And his podcast really didn't get a lot of steam. Is that a lot of people are kind of over this style of commentary, right? We saw this during the NBA playoffs, where Stephen A. Smith would be on the NBA on the ESPN show, in between games, and it became like pretty evident he didn't watch a lot of games of certain teams. You see it when he talks about the Knicks, which is again supposed to be his favorite team, right? And he wouldn't know half of the players on the roster. You would see it where they would be showcasing a smaller market team like Oklahoma City Thunder, and it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that Stephen A. didn't watch a lick of Oklahoma City throughout the regular season. You saw this, and you see it on the panels too, right? Like Kendrick Perkins calling out Stephen A. Smith for not watching games and things of that nature, and that's kind of something that's become a nuisance for a lot of fans because a lot of fans look at these like national talking heads and like, oh, are they even watching the games, right? And that's where The Ringer with Bill Simmons, Ryan Russillo, and these other guys became a little popular because they actually do watch games, right? And it also, I think, has helped to lead to the onslaught of independent creators, of fan-based media, where at least yes, they're going to be incredibly biased, but at least you know that they actually watch the games, right? And if they're watching the games, then you feel better at least knowing that their opinions come from an informed source as opposed to just throwing stuff against the wall and hoping it sticks. So let's think about how this has impacted the whole of sports media in general. You see a lot of people who feel like, all right, I'm doing my research. I'm watching the games. I'm watching film. I'm doing all this stuff. I'm using stats and numbers to back up my argument. But nobody's paying attention to what I'm saying, right? Whereas you get some person on Twitter with a random avatar going out and just posting some, half thought out take about a prominent player. And that person is getting views upon views upon views. And their stuff is getting proliferated and yours is not. And I think that that's a big negative that can be derived from this content engagement culture that we have formulated now in sports media, where it's not necessarily about who's right or who has a nuanced opinion. It's about shock value. It's why you see people posting stuff in the aftermath of a game before the emotions settle, and those just rack up engagement because a lot of times in the immediate aftermath of a game, you are emotional, you're hot-tempered, you're going to say some stuff that maybe if you had sat on it for an hour or two, it would have come a little more nuanced, right? But people love the drama, people love the controversy typically. And again, it's the parallel to the political space, I think, is incredibly important because in politics, that's the stuff that really drives home stuff, right? Where we, again, to use the Iman Khalif example of the Algerian boxer, people were jumping on the she's a man, transphobic type stuff immediately, and it became just wildfire for these accounts, right? But then when the more informed people came in, not as much engagement because, again, we are predisposed and almost conditioned, I would say, to love controversy and to crave it in a way. Like, think about when you were on Facebook like 10 years ago and you saw somebody you know from high school get into an argument over another person that you knew from high school. You'd be tuning in, kind of like with the popcorn and everything, like, yeah, let me see this drama unfold. I want to see more of this baggage get spilled. Somewhere inside of us, we have a desire for this stuff. We have a need for the controversy. It's why we watch reality TV and getting these people arguing with one another. It's intoxicating to us. And I think that's kind of coming to sports media. I think this new generation is kind of hoping to reverse course. And it's why I think Skip Bayless is going to have a hard time finding his next opportunity in as prominent of a space as it was at FS1, because I don't think ESPN wants him back. And Stephen A. Smith has basically quelled any notion that he'd be back on First Take, mainly because, and that's valid, because Stephen A. Smith is the face of ESPN, really. And you just wonder, does he show up? Does he try to really go all in on this podcast? Does he go like the Jason Whitlock route to these unconventional media outlets? But it's starting to feel like the hot take era is kind of fizzling a little bit. Even though First Take still does good numbers, a lot of people are disenchanted with Stephen A. Smith. A lot of people are kind of just over this whole, hot take culture. And I'm curious to see how it kind of proceeds here. And for a moment, we had like stuff like the Draymond Green show, which seemed like it was going away from that. But then he ultimately got sucked into that vortex as well. So maybe it never goes away. But I think there is a movement within a lot of fans to want to see it go away. And I'm happy to see that. Now, in terms of Skip, he is a complicated figure in that way, right? Like, you could say, like, yes, he was absolutely influential. He gave a lot of black men their platform to be able to kind of jump into the media space. Stephen A. Smith, Chris Broussard, of course, Shannon Sharp. So, but at the same time, what he brought in was a culture of division, a culture of derision, a culture of insulting that, isn't necessarily good faith. And I think in that aspect, he's an incredibly complex figure. But his kind of passing of the torch moment where he no longer becomes relevant, I think we're going to see more well informed people, maybe less of the quote unquote hot takes. And I think that's a good thing for sports media. And I am always positive and optimistic about the future of sports media because I think we should be able to learn from our mistakes, see what worked before, and see what didn't work, and kind of find the middle ground. So, hoping that that is the case, and I'm curious to hear what everyone else's thoughts here are on the change in sports media and hot take culture, and what your thoughts about Skip were. So, if you're listening on Spotify, make sure to leave some comments on the show. But that's going to wrap up another episode of the Deep Cover Podcast. You can follow me at my link tree, which is in the show's notes below. You could also follow and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Those will be in the link tree as well. But until next time, I'm your host, Omar Zaran, and see you next week on another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast.